I now look to Professor John Charmley to continue the case for the proposition.
Thank you very much. I think after what Shivani said, I can almost sit down, as she, I think, articulated splendidly the case. Churchill did indeed say, actually at his birthday celebrations in Tehran, to Stalin and Roosevelt, that history would treat us kindly. And when asked how he could be so sure, said, because he would write it, and he did. But not only did he write it, Sir Martin Gilbert repeated it, and many people have repeated what he said. It is not true that history repeats itself, it is sadly true that historians repeat themselves. And one of the things that I think we have to do here is we have, as Shivani has said, we have to get a balance. Churchill, I'm an old-fashioned historian. Churchill is a great man. I believe in great men. If there are no great men, Churchill is still, by the standards of politicians, a great and splendid figure. But I sustain the line that his faults are on the same scale as his achievements. And I think, and I would exempt Sir Nicholas from this, as Sir Nicholas has always presented a more balanced view, I think his defenders, writing hagiography about him, have done him no favours. There are places for being on your knees, and they're called churches. Historians should not be on their knees before anybody. They should examine with a sceptical eye the claims of autobiographers. So, and I give you one example that shows that Churchill is a person historians need to watch. In Neville Chamberlain's papers, there's a letter from Churchill in January 1940, urging the need for action now. Goes on, as Churchill's letters tended to, for about 14 pages. Edward Halifax writes back saying, Neville, what's going on? It's the coldest winter of the 20th century, nothing's moving. What's the man want? To which Neville says, calm, Edward, it's for the book. And indeed it is in the memoirs, showing that Churchill saying, I was saying even then that it was time to act. Yeah, but you couldn't actually do anything then. Churchill is brilliant at salting the mind for historians. You can almost find, certainly in the cabinet papers, in his papers, in Prem 3 and Prem 4 in the National Archive, you can find sometimes in alternate paragraphs, alternate views. I can take you through a dispatch that tells you on one level that he was opposed to the Soviets. If I choose the other paragraphs, it says he was in favour of an alliance with them. Churchill knew how historians work. In fact, he wrote far more books than even I have. He'd have been a ref star, and maybe Oxford would have recruited him as a visiting professor. But that does not mean we should take his word for anything. It means we should be extremely sceptical. Oxford is, after all, the home of lost causes. And I am here, if my Twitter feed is anything to go by, on what most of my Twitter followers think is a lost cause. We had a reference before to the Oxford Union and this House, showing its independence of mind, saying at a time when it would have been easy to virtue signal, as it then wasn't called, that this House would fight for king and country. This House had the moral courage to take a moral view and said no. I would hope that this House this evening would have the same independence of mind as its predecessors showed. Churchill is indeed an emblematic figure, there is no doubt about that. And what he is emblematic of are both the virtues of this history of our country and of its vices. So we fight for freedom. Gandhi didn't really think so because he got locked up in the name of freedom. Well, there was lots of freedom as long as you were white. There was not a lot of freedom if you were not. I don't know how many Africans or Indians voted to be members of the British Empire. So we had a war for democracy as long as you were white. Is that not something that we now have the moral courage to be ashamed of? Yes, it is. It was wrong. I yield.
Is Winston Churchill alone to be blamed for the British Empire, or is that an attitude that was shared by all 60 million Britons living in the British Empire, in Britain at the time?
I'll do two things with that one. I will say no, because there were an awful lot of people who disagreed with him, and I will take us to a point that has been made about the Bengal famine. You could say many things about the Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery. You could not say he was left-wing, you could not say he was liberal, and you could not say he was not a racist. In his diary in August 1944, he says that even by these standards, Churchill's attitude towards the Indian race is unbalanced. That's Leo Amery. I give way.
Would the Speaker distinguish between the contemporary term racism and the term that was used in the period, which is racialism, which implies a very different, more mild meaning?
I would indeed yield on that point, but I come back to what Amery is saying. Amery finds, by the standards of the time, Churchill's attitude to Indians unbalanced. And more. In October, he has a fundamental argument with Churchill where he says, I cannot see the difference between your attitude to Indians and Hitler's attitude to the Jews. That is not coming from a socialist. That is coming from a lifelong imperialist. We fail to take that seriously at our peril. That is not to take any point away from Churchill and his achievements. It is to place them in a context. And that context is, you can write, as Eisenhower did, about a crusade for freedom. You can write about liberating Europe. I've met few Poles who agreed that they were liberated as a result of what Britain did. I've met many who felt sold down the river, and I use that phrase advisedly. So we have to look at a balance here. And what I would suggest to you is that if we compare, we were talking about statues a moment ago, let us talk about statues. Statues matter. Outside Parliament, we have a statue of Churchill, and we have one of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell, a man of deep spirituality and deep prejudices. When he was being painted by the portrait painter Peter Lilly, Lilly tried to flatter him and said, we can leave the warts out, Lord Protector. Cromwell said, paint me warts and all. Churchill has not been painted warts and all. Churchill left the warts out. I do not say he was all warts. That would be ludicrous. But I do say that we have erected here a shrine, and I use the word advisedly. I spent a year in Missouri, in Fulton, in a Wren church, the crypt of which is full of memorabilia, relics, if you will, of Churchill. I've no problem with any of this. It's a cultural thing. I have a problem with it masquerading as history. We need to see Churchill and our own history for what it is. We need not to take comfort as Britain declined after World War II. And Churchill, we wrapped him to us as a comfort blanket as we ceased to matter, because the last time we will ever matter in world history was May 1940. I take nothing away from Churchill's achievement then. I simply add to it that we have here a man who, whilst defending democracy in this country and in the West, denied it to huge swathes of the world. And I have a problem with a man who thought women were not fit to vote. I have a problem with a man who thought that Indians were incapable of self-government. You can say he was a man of his time, but I go back to Leo Amery, equally a man of his time. Amery thought Churchill unbalanced. I think Churchill was unbalanced there. I do not argue we should take an unbalanced view of him. I argue the opposite. I argue that if we take a balanced view of Churchill, we get not the two-dimensional hagiographical icon. We get something much more in the Western tradition. A portrait with light and dark, where we see the warts. And I come back at the end to Siobhan's point. We see ourselves in a mirror darkly. And if we do not like some of the things we see, that is good for us as human beings, and we should have the humility to admit that light and darkness coexist. Thank you very much.